I don't have the answer here, but can you guess how much money you've raised over the course of all the films you've made?
Oh, wow. In those days, the variety people would always refer to me, in Carolco days, as the, quote, smartest guy in Hollywood, end quote. Of course, they made huge sums of money on it, and how much they got out of the money that was stolen, who knows? This is as crazy as it could possibly get. In the core of what I had done in my career, for what I was known for, and for them to then come up with this nonsense. I was on the boat in Cannes that year that I made the deal, and Schwarzenegger was there, and Schwarzenegger wanted to play Spider-Man. You know, after we paid all this money for this script, we paid like $4 million for that script. If you negotiate from a standpoint that you think that there's only a certain amount at risk or to gain, then, you know, it's a us versus them. But a lot of times you can do it so that you expand the pie. There's more for everybody. Movies are about feelings. They're about a projection of emotion. Spielberg always likes to say you cut on emotion. You cut on the, you know, the transition of an emotional element. Because if you try to make what somebody else is making or what somebody else thinks is a great movie, you're going to fail. That's somebody else's success. And somebody said to him, Jerome, what are you doing investing all this money in the film business? Don't you know everybody loses money in the film business? To which Jerome said, somebody's making money. The question is who? There's this one picture you got to put in the deal. You got to put in the deal. It's a strange thing. You only have international rights. It's very expensive and all that, but you got to have this picture in the deal. How much does the picture cost? I said, well, it's going to be over $200 million. And he said, no, we're never going to do a picture. We can't do that. We're going to do a deal of $20 million for Michael for Basic Instinct. And I said, no, we're not. We can't do that. And we levied on it and took the rights to Terminator. Yeah. And so we got it outright for $10 million. We had the Lord of the Rings. And I said, Bob, you were part of Warner. All right. You had Warner's budget. You could spend $100 million on a picture. We had to pay $100 million ourselves, right? We had to raise it. We had to have bank lines to get it. Getting talent without the directors is very hard. But with the great directors, the talent want to work with the great directors. You get them, you'll get the talent. Nobody likes that. You don't tell Jim Cameron that. Everybody in the business tells me you're out of your mind to do that with a talent like that. The deal I did for Brando is a beautiful plan. And, you know, if it pisses people off, then so be it. They were bad deals then, they're bad deals now, and nobody who knows what they're doing would do those deals. Here you have a U.S. citizen, he gets $110 million in the islands and pays no taxes. And it's a very high-profile thing. If I can deal with this level of irrationality, then I can go through anything. That I completely reject everything about this case. There are people I had at Terminal Island who did bad things, and they needed to be responsible for them. And if I did bad things, and I have done bad things in my life, I want to take responsibility for them. I'm not afraid of that, but not this. It is not easy, but, you know, I'm living with it. And the people that are around me that I care about me are all fine about it. They all know that it was complete bullpucky, and we have to, you know, rely on the fact that I know what the truth is. Because how's the smartest guy in Hollywood? What's he doing in jail for something he didn't do?
What is Bardo, and why is it so meaningful to you?
The Bardo is a phrase from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and it refers to the 3 levels of process that occurs when a person dies. And they have first a ground luminosity, and then they have a coalescing of events and color. And the 3rd level is when you remember back in absolute clarity all the things of your life back to the beginning. It's a way of kind of learning about it. And in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, after that occurs, you then make a choice. You either you're still tied into this world and all the things that happened and you want to go back, or you then can go into the light as the alternative. We made a picture about this called Jacob's Ladder. And in that particular book, in our version of it, Tim Robbins does go into the light with an uncredited Macaulay Culkin. So to me, even though I'm not dead, this was a way to think about being in prison for something I didn't do and trying to get past the rage of that and to learn from it. And naturally, just sort of a reflection back as I go through all the things of my life, not only the things that led to that event, but also throughout my life, then I figured that was a process by which you could have the knowledge that you get in the Bardo experience without having to be dead. And indeed, the Dalai Lama says that that can happen, that you can actually have the Bardo experience even though you are still alive, and you're actually going to be able to incorporate that into your ongoing existence.
Is there a relationship between Bardo and a karmic wind, not your book, but the philosophy.
In one of the leading books that talks about the Tibetan Book of the Dead by a disciple of the Dalai Lama, he refers to this phrase as karmic winds, as what you experience in the bardo when you're remembering back and thinking about all the things that buffeted you and all the nice Buddhas and the nasty Buddhas and all the things that happened to you. Those he refers to as karmic winds, in the sense that they're things that, as I associate with, not things that you have control over, not things that you necessarily could have done things differently and changed, but they were just events in the world, like the weather, like the way the sun shines on a particular day, like what another person does that you have no control over. Those are things that then, when you add it all up, when you look at it in total as you're going backwards, our minds tell us to make a picture of that. Our minds say, put some meaning in that. Our minds want to try to make something of it. And so that process is what, in the bardo, he calls the karmic winds. This guy named Ripal is the name of the Tibetan who wrote this book.
Would you mind holding up your book for a moment?
With pleasure.
It's a beautiful cover.
Thank you.
How did writing this book help you survive in prison?
Well, it was something to do, first of all. One of the things you have to learn when you're in that kind of environment is you have to have a discipline so that you go through your day with a plan and not just wake up in the morning and say, oh my God, I'm in prison and and I didn't do anything and I'm with people I would never want to know necessarily. And so this was a way of like exercise and certain dieting and things that I would develop as a discipline day to day to get through this experience. I was encouraged to do it by my wife and by my law partner, Ray Gibson, and by this banker I know who's a good friend of mine, Slava Vladimirov. And they encouraged me to do it because they thought it would be a good discipline. And they also thought that the stories would be interesting to people and that there would be something to be learned from my experiences.
Out of curiosity, what would you write on? A legal pad? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, just a regular legal pad. I had my daughter send me a whole bunch of my 8.5 by 11 legal pads, and so I would write it all out hand, and then I would send it to them, and since I have bad handwriting, it took them to be able to interpret it.
Why did you write Karmic Winds, Reflections from the Smartest Guy in Hollywood?
One of the people who also helped me with this is a guy named Rex Weiner, who was he was married to Ava Gardos, who's a great editor and a good friend of mine. We made a picture together, and he's been down in New Orleans, and he was the head of the main guy at Variety in the old days. And in those days, the Variety people would always refer to me in Carolco days as the, quote, smartest guy in Hollywood, end quote. And so this Rex kept saying, you got to put that in the title, because that's what people know. And I said, well, I'll do it if we put it in quotes, because how's the smartest guy in Hollywood? What's he doing in jail for something he didn't do? But to me, it allowed a way to kind of reference what my reputation was and suggest to people that, gee, he was doing a lot of interesting things, and suggest that perhaps there was an ironic context to it all.
We're going to come back to the lawsuit and your time in prison, but we'd first like to hear about your time in the business.
Sure.
Can you tell us about
Well, I didn't really expect to be in the film business when I came out here. I went to a big law firm where I was going to spend half my time doing complicated tax deals and tax work, and the other half doing public interest work. And it kind of got sucked into the film business, mainly because of a client called Alexander Salkind, who had made the first Superman movies. And he had, as the Warner executive said at the time, more problems than God. And a lot of those were tax problems. And I got involved in that and then involved in a whole bunch of other related matters. And suddenly, as a result of doing immodestly some great stuff for Alex, everybody in the business is talking about me at a very young age. And I got to be friends with a man named Tom Pollock, who at that time was considered the top entertainment lawyer in town. He had represented George Lucas and sold Star Wars to Fox. Famous story that he told me was that, when the executive was so known for talking silently, he said, he would talk so silently, we thought he said yes, and he really didn't. But in any event, Fox made the movie and became a legend, and Tom became everybody's lawyer. And Tom was representing Alex in his deals with Warner Brothers The firm I was with, Irella Manella, was brought in to deal with these various tax problems and tax-oriented investments. And so he and I got to be very good friends. And he became sort of a big advocate of me. You got to deal with this guy, and blah, blah. And so suddenly I'm representing all of the independent producers and a lot of artists as well. And suddenly, instead of spending half my time on public interest, I'm spending all my time in the entertainment business.
How did you meet Albert Grossman?
He was a client of this law firm, Irella Manella. And Werner Wolfen, the senior partner, said, you know about Albert Grossman. I said, Albert Grossman's a legend. Of course I know who Albert Grossman is. And he said, look, Albert has a couple of issues we need to deal with. I think you might like him. And I remember meeting Albert, getting on an airplane here in Los Angeles. And it was one of those funny things, and he just we immediately hit it off. It was like, we knew each other forever, right? And he just really gravitated to me. And suddenly, again, I'm like a 27-year-old guy, and he wants me to do all of his stuff. And of course, I'm learning a lot from him because Albert had an amazing mind. He was a very interesting man on so many levels. And then I met my wife through him. I got involved in all the stuff he was doing up in Woodstock. And again, we did some very good work for Albert. And Albert made me the executor of his estate and the trustee of his trust. And, he put a lot of faith in me. And that means a lot to me, that a guy like that would have, seen this, whatever talents I had, and was worth that kind of trust.
What did Albert teach you about people?
Well, Albert, I would say, had both a humorous and cynical view about the people he dealt with in the business. In other words, he always had to try to keep a light tone on it, even when there was reasons to be angry. And he had also a very good way of trying to negotiate. In other words, he was always trying to, if somebody wanted to go in that direction, fine, you just need to find what's good in this direction for you. And so he was always trying to find a way to let the person have what they want, but get what you want. I call it the 1 + 1 = 3 theory of negotiating. If you negotiate from a standpoint that you think that there's only a certain amount at risk or to gain, then, it's a us versus them. But a lot of times you can do it so that you expand the pie, there's more for everybody, and it's in thinking that way and talking that way and arguing that way, which was what Albert would do. That was where, he really taught me a lot about negotiating and about how to really make great deals. Because the great deals are not made because you're the toughest ass guy and you push and shout and exercise your negotiating power. They're because you see the tableau of potential and you try to get the things that ultimately will mean the most to you, where you'll make the most at the end of the day. And whether the other guy does or not isn't your problem, but what it is that you will. And he was really quite brilliant at that. He revolutionized negotiating in the film, in the music business and the record business, basically through that kind of approach. And that was why he became such a legend for making what were, in retrospect, incredible deals for people.
Do you have a favorite Albert Grossman story?
Oh, heavens. But, part of the thing with Albert is that when we would sit up, at his, he had a house in Woodstock, actually at Bearsville, right outside of Woodstock. And we'd sit out on the porch and, Albert liked to smoke the odd joint. So we'd sit out there and here I am, some kid smoking dope with Albert Grossman, telling stories about all these legendary people, So a lot of it was Albert, telling stories of what happened, and me kind of learning from it, as he would kind of explain it to me as some kind of a son that he never had, And so the things that I remember the most are stories that he would tell about his dealings with some of these very famous people that he used to deal with. And particularly Janis Joplin, because he loved Janis. And, she was such a self-destructive person that it was really hard for him, and particularly when she would go on the drugs, and he would try and talk her out of it. And so a lot of the stories were his interactions with her as he's trying to get her to just be who she is. it's one of the stories he told me when, at Woodstock, she came over to his house and she was so high and everything. And she said, man, it's so hard to be Janice. And, Albert said, I just said to her, there's a lot of things you just have to be you in that moment, and because she was already taken on Michael Pollard's accent, and the way he talked, and Michael Pollard had a certain way of talking. She would want to talk like that, and he was just trying to just let her be Janice, and it was so hard for her. She was like she always had to be on, and so I always think of those stories that he told about Janice because he just cared so much about her. Now, he was also, Dylan wrote that famous song, Dear Landlord, because, he broke up with Albert because he felt Albert was making way too much money off of him, all right? In fact, it turns out Dylan never made as much money as he made during those years with Albert. And, but nevertheless, this was a big problem, and he wrote that song, Dear Landlord. And Albert did have very good deals for himself with the artists, but he also really did well for them. And Janice was one of the ones who never once complained about the deals, always gave him exactly what he wanted, and always felt that he was adding so much value to her that she was much better off either way, which is the way he looked at it. And but that just with all that kind of history of him, and with Dylan particularly, and then to see how much he cared about Janice, that was the thing that sort of sticks to me. I tried for years to put together a movie based on her life, and just couldn't pull it together. But, she was a remarkable young woman and a really tragic story. So that was a way of connecting to Albert through that. So those are the things I remember, those stories, and a bunch of Dylan stories, which I'm not going to tell. But
You say that one of your most fulfilling days in your legal career was when John Fogerty of CCR said to you, man, I never understood that plan until now. Thank you for telling us. Can you tell us more of this story?
Sure. Again, one of the things that sort of was dropped on my desk was, again, by this same senior lawyer at Irella Manella, Werner Wolfen. He said, look, this is this terrible tax plan that Saul Zaentz got the Creedence guys into, and Joe Smith called me up and said he's got this great artist at Electra Asylum and he won't record. He's so upset because of what happened. Can you get into it with this other guy from Yale, Ken Seidel? And so I said, fantastic. Creedence? Wow, And then, of course, we got into it, and it was just a terrible story. I mean, the way John tells it, he had one of these bad 5-on-90 deals with Saul Zaentz at Fantasy Records, which was a jazz label. And out of nowhere, they get this thing. It becomes like gigantic hits. It's the sound of the era, and they're making a lot of money. So the way John tells the story, he came into Saul and said, hey, man, I think we're doing well here. Let's have a raise. I'm entitled to a raise. To which Saul said, I'm going to do something better than a raise for you. I'm going to put you in this deal in the Bahamas, and you're not going to pay any taxes. And so John, to his infinite regret, went along with this. All right. And except BMI. All the money, all the great money was going to this trust in the Bahamas, except BMI would never pay the trust, thank God. And then one day, two things happened. The IRS assessed him for 125% of what he ever made, and all that money in the Bahamas in that bank, poof, gone. They just took the money because he hadn't really protected the money but Saul got all his money out, all right? Yeah. John was a very unhappy guy. He was mad at himself, of course, very mad at himself for doing this and for getting his brother into it. And he just was in a bad, bad place. And so we sued everybody. Saul got out of it because they claimed that, he didn't have a fiduciary duty to John. But the lawyers and accountants who put him in the deal, including this, devilish individual from Chicago, Bert Canner, who's now no longer with us, we sued all them, and we won it all back in a jury verdict, all his money back. And we got it back so that all the taxing went away, and we even had, of the $10 million John got, 2/3 of it was non-taxable. It was an amazing deal. And, the law firm decided that even though I was so young, that since I knew the case so well, that I should be the expert witness. So I went up to San Francisco and I sat there, and not only had I done the examination of Bert Canner to show how ridiculous this scheme was, but then I testified in court for about 3 hours, basically explaining to the jury how negligent this scheme was and why these lawyers and accountants committed terrible malpractice in letting John do this. And it was after that testimony that he came up to me and said what he said, which truly is one of the most beautiful moments of my career, that he really appreciated it. We got all his money back. And then, of course, after that, he did a record called Center Field. Put me in, coach. I'm ready to play today. And he also had a song on that album called Zance Can't Dance, but He'll Steal Your Money. Zance Can't Dance, but He'll Steal You Blind. So Saul then sued John not only for defamation, but sued him for copyright infringement, claiming that the songs on Center Field infringed John's own songs that Saul owned at Fantasy Music. And we had to try that case. I didn't go up for that because my partner, Ken Seidel, tried that case. And of course, the jury was out for 10 minutes to come back to say a man can't infringe his own songs, all right? That case actually went to the Supreme Court on the question of illegal fees. But, Saul Zaentz, in fact, one of the early podcasts I had was with a guy who was a big fan of Saul Zaentz and thinks about the two great movies that Saul was involved in and how passionate he was. And I said, that may be, but my experience with Saul Zaentz was with what he did to John Fogerty, and what he did with John Fogerty was just simply unacceptable. It was appalling, and he should have done the right thing by the man, and he didn't. To the end, he didn't, And the idea that he got that money out of there and let them steal John's money, may he rest in peace. But Saul Zaentz, to me and to all of us who worked on those cases, did a very bad thing. But it was a very interesting thing to go through the case, because there were so many interesting tax issues that were there, which of course were done terribly by Bert Canner, this former agent who was specialized in these offshore plans, all right? And I knew a lot about offshore plans, so this one was a terrible one. This was a bad deal all the way around, right? One of my favorite stories is that I took Bert Canner's deposition up in San Francisco, and I just wanted to catch him on a few things where it was just clearly wrong, right? And one of them was this: that when he had the boys sell what he called the products of their services to the trust, and then he reported that as capital gain. All right, and of course you couldn't have capital gain. You can't have capital gain on the products of your own services to begin with. But there was another issue about it. He reported it as long-term capital gain. And of course you can't have a holding period of an asset until you own the asset. So you can't have a holding period on a master recording, even if you could have owned it, which it was not because it was really owned by Fantasy to begin with. But you couldn't own that until the holding period didn't start until it came into existence. So of course there could not have been a 6-month holding period on this. So I said to Saul, I said to Bert Canner, I said, so what is the holding period of the products of his services? And so Canner looks at me in that sort of grinning way, knowing it's all bullpucky, and says, well, it's kind of like it's the inchoate right to withhold your services. And I said, and so when does this holding period start? And he said, at birth. I burst out laughing, and he could barely contain his laughter. But to me, that was the idea. You put an artist like the Fogerty into a tax plan on something that ridiculous, and of course they made huge sums of money on it, and how much they got out of the money that was stolen, who knows? But that was a bad story. But it was a great thing for me. It was one of those things where you get a fastball right down the center of the plate, and I just whacked it into the stands. And I still feel very good about that. And
many of those tax shelters don't exist anymore. Is that correct? Or
oh no,
they still do? Okay.
Those deals that Canner did were bad deals. They were bad deals then. They're bad deals now, and nobody who knows what they're doing would do those deals, right? But the use of international trusts and other companies to shelter money from the U.S. is, wow, everyone's doing it, particularly in the finance business and the insurance business. That's where you see the most of it. What you didn't see was a lot of it in the entertainment business. There's a lot of reasons for that, but that was, when I was working with all these international independents, we were dealing with people that had genuine international connections. So when we were structuring things, I was structuring them so there wasn't any U.S. tax on it, but it, in my opinion, made sense. But nevertheless, that would lead to my first battle with the feds so I had structured when I joined Carolco and sort of redid everything, I structured it so that Andy and Mario owned their interests through these decontrolled companies in the islands. And then when we bought out Vina for $110 million, that was all tax-free. And that got a lot of publicity, and that upset the revenue. And so that was when they first came after me for things on my return, which they just were using as an excuse to attack me so that it would scare people away from doing what they did with doing what I did for Vina and the Qassar. And at the end of the day, the government surrendered on those cases, and I beat them in court on those cases. But nevertheless, it tarnished my reputation. Some people thought that, there must have been something there, even though there wasn't. And it made me sort of an enemy of the revenue. And ultimately, the feds down in New Orleans said that was what they thought. I got away with it once, they said, not going to get away with it again.
Right. I saw someone I thought this was Carol Burnett's company,
They got it off the shelf in Panama. Some lawyer in Panama had a wife or daughter named Carol and named it Carolco because they were putting a bunch of companies on the shelf.
Okay.
And they had the name and they were using it, so I just kept the name. But my mother's name is Carol, so it turned out to have a kind of a funny resonance. But
yeah, okay.
Neither Andy or Mario had any Carols in their life.
Okay. Was joining Carolco in 1986 an easy decision for you?
No, it wasn't. I was leaving the practice. There was going to be, I knew there was going to be, kickback from clients that were very close to me, that I was not going to be representing them anymore. These guys, I knew them, but it wasn't like I wasn't as close to them, say, as I was with Dolly Parton, or even with the guys at Canon, or with the Salkins and all the people involved with them. And so there was some risk involved with that, but they offered me a lot of money. But the main thing was that I saw as an opportunity that they could really be the true successors of Dino De Laurentiis. They could make the kinds of movies that Canon wasn't making, and do it in a way that would be better than the way Alex did it. And that all turned out to be true. These guys, particularly Qassar, was quite a showman. And we ended up having a heck of a run.
His father had also been in the film industry.
Yeah, he was, Fidel. Fidel was a foreign sales agent. He out of Lebanon. They were Maronite from Lebanon, but they basically were based out of Rome. Mario learned at his father's knee. As he used to say, he had to steal the cigarette money in order to get paid. I'll say one thing that's a little off color, which I assume you can edit if you want to take it out. But the relationship between Mario and Fidel was a strange one. Mario once said to me, he said, trying to do business with Fidel is like trying to a ghost. So
maybe we can bleep it. Yeah. Okay.
So there's something about Mario too in that. Mario also had a kind of slipperiness about him that sometimes made it hard to pin down. But he was a great showman, and when he was on his game, there was nobody better. And that was what I saw. I saw these guys were the real thing. And so it began that great 6 years.
When you became CEO of Carolco, the first order of business was to set up a tax structure.
Well, no, yeah.
Can you help us understand what was your first?
Well, they had a tax structure set up. I mean, they were offshore, all right? But that tax structure, in my opinion, was not sustainable, should it ever be looked at, all right? And the second part of it was that when they had gotten the money to make First Blood, the First Blood was the first picture they made. Before that, Andy and Mario had basically joined forces as foreign sales agents, with Mario being a guy who handled the Middle East, and Andy had a little company in Hong Kong, would buy the Hong Kong and the Chinese territories. And they got together and they were selling a bunch of tax shelter pictures that were done in Canada, right, with Robert Lantos. And they wanted to make a movie, and their first movie they made was First Blood, which of course is quite a substantial success. And they got the money to do that, the $14 million, as a loan from a banker in Lebanon that was a friend of Fidel's, a guy named Joseph, God, I can't remember Joseph's last name. Joseph Khoury? I can't remember. in any event, Joseph said, sure, I'll give you the loan from my bank, and also I want a third of the company. So they had a third of the company with Joseph, and now suddenly the sequel rights to this picture are valuable, right? So the issue was, how do we both get this to a proper tax structure that can sustain an examination, and at the same time freeze out Joseph so we can buy him out before we have to deal with the Rambo 2, all right? And that's what we did. That was the first order of business, was the freeze out of Joseph and the movement of the companies into the Dutch Antilles, and with ownership through what we called a Dutch sandwich in those days, and then decontrolled through these trusts for the family members that were still outside the U.S. That was the structure that when it became relevant and became attacked, that was the one that ultimately we prevailed on, that the government hated, because here you have a U.S. citizen, he gets $110 million in the islands and pays no taxes, and it's a very high-profile thing, right? So, the government didn't like that at all. The problem with it was that the government had no case. And they knew this because they had already gone through this thing. I had done about $300 million worth of tax deals with Warner Brothers on a P&A deal, what we call a bracket conversion deal. And they had audited that, and they changed it, but they didn't like that either, all right? And so now they're looking at a situation where do they change a deal where you have a U.S. citizen gets $110 million in the islands and pays no taxes, and everyone in the industry knows about it, When I had done the deal, I had done a tax deal to make the tax consequences to Marlon Brando and solving the participation dispute on Superman. This was the first big deal I had done. And when I did it, Don Pollock said to me, man, you should copyright those documents. Everyone's going to copy you. And they did, by the way, And so I think there was a view that because of the very high visibility I had, that people would be copying this scheme. Now, in fact, it wasn't so easy to copy, and it was really dependent on some unique facts that applied to Andy and Mario. But nevertheless, I think that's why they just got crazy. And then they thought it was easy. They were going to assess it all, and they screwed up the assessment. They assessed the wrong companies. So they were actually barred. They were in trouble. And that's when they decided to investigate me and find something they could prosecute me for, because that would send a message. And it did, sent that message. Later I ran into Tony Scotti, who was on my board at Carolco, and he had just sold his company, All American Television, for $100 million. I ran him to a NATPE, and he said, Peter, I want you to know that I paid all my taxes. To which I said, Tony, I'm glad somebody is. So in any event, that's why that all happened. And I look on it in retrospect. Should I have avoided that? No, I thought it was a brilliant plan. Again, one of the stories I tell in the book is, Andy, after we got the government's all over him, and this is like the worst. And I had warned him of all this. I said, when this happens, if they want to come after you, they're going to come after you with a ton of bricks. And I said at the time, you don't want this in your life, pay your taxes, all right? Which, as Mario would say, was like talking to the lamp. They were never going to pay their taxes, right? So, and so they came after him. So Andy was nervous, and he had psoriasis, and he's itching, and he hired an ex-IRS commissioner to review all that I had done, right? And so I had a big meeting over at Irela Manella with this guy who wanted to examine me about the plan. And I don't know, I was actually, my memory's being fairly relaxed about it, because I had reviewed this plan with the IRL people. It wasn't like I did all this with just on my own, right? And the guy came in there and he said, I'm not sure I fully understand what you did here with the trust. Would you explain that? And so I said, it's really simple. There's a loophole in the code. They did these grantor tax rules, grantor trust rules, to eliminate trusts, to basically stop people from using trusts in the U.S. to avoid taxes. So it makes this rule, but they screwed up because they didn't say that only applies to U.S. trusts. It also applies to foreign trusts. So if you have a grantor trust that's a foreign trust, then the code insists that the owner has to be the grantor of the trust, no matter who really controls the money. Because the last thing we were going to do after what John Fogerty went in was have Andy and Mario's money overseas in a bank account they didn't control, right? or have controlled by like Bankers Trust International or some important company that wouldn't abscond with the money, right? So, so in any event, that's what I said to him. So, that's the problem that the government has. And he says, so you violated the grantor trust rules? Yeah, I said, I got 3 tests. I violated them all to make sure. I mean, these are grantor trusts and nothing you can do about it. Therefore, the companies are not owned by U.S. citizens. Therefore, it's not subject to tax in the U.S. Period, full stop. And he leant back and said, it's quite brilliant, thank you. And the government basically conceded. At the end, they came in and said to Andy, well, would you agree to assessment of 5%? So Andy calls me up and says, you told me I was going to win. I said, Andy, I told you, you're going to be a lot better off by doing this plan than if you just paid your taxes. So you would have paid about $55 million in taxes if you'd done the thing. So if you're talking about paying the government $3 to $4 million, are you better off? He said, yeah, I guess I should do the deal. I said, you should do the deal. And then they took care of this SAR audit and it was over. And Andy saved $50-odd million in taxes on the thing where you had the government crazy with you. And so that usually means it was as bulletproof a scheme as you can have. And so I think it was a beautiful plan, just like I think the deal I did for Brando was a beautiful plan. And, if it pisses people off, then so be it.
What was the overall business strategy you put in place when you started Carolco?
Well, I didn't start Carolco. They started it. I came in, and we had a strategy when we went public. So I think I developed a strategy for what we were going to do as a public company, other than making more Rambos, because that's what basically the strategy at that point was. Let's make Rambo 2 and Rambo 3, right? So, so we developed what I called a diversification strategy in those days, which was that we wanted to broaden the amount of rights that we owned and then expand the number of pictures, and always a balanced slate, okay? And the diversification first was to buy a video company, and the second to buy a TV distribution company, and then to buy a lot of rights, of video company rights and TV rights. And we did all that, and that really became the ballast of it. So when we went public, it was based on the fact that we were going to take having this unique property, Rambo, and then adding a whole bunch of film rights into it. So you had a library, and you had distribution in television, foreign, and the U.S. video, right? Not theatrical. We gave theatrical to TriStar, but the idea was to build out distribution. Tom Pollock had always said to me, studio has 2 assets, a library and distribution. And the rest is just whatever pictures you can make, right? Which can vary year to year, and some will be good and fail, some will be terrible and work, and some will be good and also work. So you just don't know, all right? And so that was what we did. So we bought a video company, IVE, then I bought Vestron, so we ended up having, like 4,000 titles. We were the number 4 rated company of all video companies in 1990, the year right after Jose was killed. And then we bought the Hemdale Library, and we bought a couple of other smaller TV libraries. So we had almost 150 really good films in the television library. And so, we had some real ballast in the ship, as I like to say. And we brought in some strategic investors, Canal Plus, Pioneer Electronics, Rizzoli, Coriel de Lazara, all to have equity and to be part of it. That was how the company survived. So that was the diversification strategy, and as a public company, we did very well for a while.
And as an international independent film company, you wanted to work with the best actors, writers, and filmmakers?
Well, Mario was the one who really understood that the issue for independence was not trying to, do the way Canon did, which is to make a lot of low-budget movies and sell them to video. It was to break the talent oligopoly that the studios controlled. The studio's main asset with talent is that everybody has a talent relationship with the studio. They pay them a lot of money, and you develop relationships, and those relationships tend to last over time. And so each studio has certain relationships that they curry. Breaking those relationships, getting them to work for an independent, that was the big challenge. And that was what Mario set out to do. And, obviously I was fully supportive of this, but that was him. I'm going to get the best directors. I'm going to get the best directors out there. And I remember in our big show at Cannes in 1990, at the height of it, we had, Oliver Stone, Jim Cameron, Paul Verhoeven, I mean, just a unbelievable list of Adrian Lyne. I can't remember them all, and so that was it. Get the great directors, and the great directors will get you the talent. You're getting talent without the directors is very hard, but with the great directors, the talent want to work with the great directors. You get them, you'll get the talent. And then, of course, the question is what material. And usually with Mario, as many of the independents, if a great director wants to do the script, who even needs to read it, right? But of course, you do need to read it. You do need to be involved in it and make those choices. And I think we developed a staff that worked with it, and ended up getting the great directors working on really great projects, and projects with risk in them. They weren't all, doing Rambo and Terminator was straight ahead. Only question is, how much are you going to pay for it, right? But some of these others, they were much more risky, like The Doors, when we took on that from Universal when Tom sold That's That, or Chaplin, which was a picture we shouldn't have made, but is still a great piece of work. Field of Dreams, when Tommy gave us that one because, Universal had envied foreign. But they thought the foreign was worth zero, all right, on that picture. And he couldn't get a green light on the title, with zero out of foreign. So we gave him 50% of the budget for the foreign. And, and that was a risk. That was a risk. But, we got it all back out of Japan alone, all right? And, of course, it's a fabulous title, So, those were the kinds of choices that were made. So the material became part of it, but it was built around, you get the directors, that will get you the talent, that you can sell for pre-sales, and, then you hopefully get good projects for them to do.
Did Carolco drive up the price of actors? So say $20 million per blockbuster?
Well, that's an interesting story. We were blamed for that when we paid Schwarzenegger $14 million for Terminator 2. Everybody thought we were breaking all the price levels in the business. But to me, we weren't. And for those who understood it, because when the studio pays you that, they pay against the share of the gross, and it's their gross at the source. But we don't get the source gross. So when we pay the $14 million, but we pay it against only what comes into us after the studio takes their fees. So our back end is very, very different. So I looked at it as a little bit buying back end on titles, all right? But, that was not a huge move, The problem came up in a different way. When we were going to do Basic Instinct, and Mario was absolutely convinced that he had to have Michael Douglas. That was when he thought he could get Adrian Lyne and Michael Douglas back together again, which was never going to happen, right? But, literally all of us knew Paul Verhoeven wanted to do it because it was very similar to a Dutch picture he had done called The Fourth Man. And literally I can remember pushing Mario and saying, offer him the damn picture, Mario. After we paid all this money for this script, we paid like $4 million for that script. And then he made, and we were at Cannes, and we were hanging out with Michael Douglas and his wife in Ibiza, and Mario said, you got to be in the picture, $20 million. And I said, Mario, no, you can't do that, And no, it's $20 million. So we get back to LA, and I get a call from Ronnie Meyer, and he said, so we're going to do a deal of $20 million for Michael for Basic Instinct. And I said, no, we're not. We can't do that. I said, look, we paid Schwarzenegger $14 million for Terminator 2. What happens if he learns that we paid $20 million and nobody's gotten $20 million? This is going to get everybody crazy. We can't do it. Back and forth. I finally said, okay, if you keep it a secret, knowing he wouldn't, but if you keep it a secret, $14 million plus $1 million for JoJo as a producer, right, the brother, all right? That's what we'll do, 15, all right, 14 and 1. It took about a week for Schwarzenegger to find out about it, all right? And then the screaming started. And so I said to Mario, I said, look, what's to argue? You go to Arnold and you say, what would you like, sir? We love you. We want you to be in our movie. What would it take? And he said, I want you to buy me an airplane. Perfect. We buy him an airplane. So we bought him an airplane. So he was happy, and we stopped at 15. But we weren't the ones who broke the price to 20. I stopped that. That was Mark Canton, all right, on a picture called Last Action Hero. He was the one who broke the price to 20. And then everybody started getting upset about that. But it didn't matter because, like when Cruise on Mission Impossible 3, he just said, "I don't care about my fee. I just want my gross deal, 20%, and video in at 100%." You know, I remember, you know, the guy Bill Bernstein was my buddy at Paramount. He said, "You know, here's what happened on the movie. You know, Cruise is going to make $110 million on the picture. We're going to basically make $5 to $10 million on gross margin on the picture." You know, so it doesn't matter really what the front end fee was. It mattered what the participation would be worth on a picture that does that kind of business. So in any event, we did not break the price to 20. I stopped it at 14 to 15 in a situation where we were giving a substantial against the back end because these guys wouldn't have seen anything on the back end on those pictures. Whereas if they had been in a studio deal, they would have seen a lot. All right. So I'm fine with that. And I don't think we really broke any price levels, but definitely we broke through the talent oligopoly, and the studios did not like it, believe me. And nobody's really done it since.
How does an A-list star impact the budget of a movie?
Well, you know, it's funny. I mean, on some level, it shouldn't have any effect. You know, the movie is what it costs, right? But in fact, if you start paying everybody a lot of money, then everything goes up. Right? What Don Dolden used to call everybody's appetite gets, you know, they want a bigger meal, right? I remember a discussion I had with Alan Marshall on the budget on Basic Instinct, you know, and he's got, he wants to go he wants to shoot it both in Los Angeles and San Francisco, use translights up there in the studio down here, and he shows me a budget, you know, for $25 million below the line. And I said, "Alan," again, pardon my vernacular, but so you know what I said, "Alan, how do you spend $25 million on people in a room? Please, come on. I mean, this picture should be $15 million max below the line." And he said to me, he said, "Look, if you're paying Michael Douglas $15 million and Paul Verhoeven $5 million, what are you supposed to do? You know, and you're paying Jean de Bont, you know, $15,000 a week. Everybody knows what's going on. You know, there's no, you know, everybody has the appetite increase." And so you know, later at the Academy Awards, you know, Paul said to me, "You're mad at me. You're mad at me because you know I made Fourth Man for $1 million and it took us $56 million to make this picture." I said, "Paul, look, how can I be mad at you? You made a great movie. It's a legend. To me, it's one of the greatest noir pictures ever made. It is a picture with many layers. It is a picture that appeals on different levels, and there's a lot of things that go on to it because Verhoeven is truly a genius. So how could anyone be mad? And it's #1 worldwide grosser, right? But I did think to myself, you still could have made that picture for $40 million, you know, and it still would have been just as good, in my opinion. But in any event, that's the nature of the film business, you know. And yes, having the high-end talent drives up all the costs because everybody wants more. And they want more time. They want more days. They want appetite increases.
Carolco had the highest grossing movie back-to-back for 2 years. Has an independent studio ever done this?
Nope.
Since?
Nope. You know, Bob Shea, who was my buddy, used to say, "Well, we had the Lord of the Rings." And I said, "Bob, you were part of Warner, all right? You had Warner's budget. You could spend $100 million on a picture. We had to pay $100 million ourselves, right? We had to raise it. We had to have bank lines to get it. So I consider those studio movies. I don't consider those independent movies. But he and I can have that kind of little disagreement on it. But nevertheless, yes, nobody has ever done it. No one ever will do it because with the cost of movies today, you can't, no independent could spend what these people spend on movies today."
Was Cannes 1990 the peak for Carolco?
Yeah, it was. You know, we had this incredible party. We had the Gypsy Kings come out at the Ducap, you know, and you know, we had all these talent. You know, we had Stallone and Schwarzenegger when they weren't friends, as well as Michael Douglas and you know, Jean-Claude Van Damme. I mean, you know, it was an amazing show. We had a talent like no one had ever seen. And yes, that was the high point. That was the high point.
How close was Carolco to getting the rights for Superman?
Not Superman, Spider-Man.
Spider-Man, I'm sorry.
We had the rights to Spider-Man. We had the rights to Spider-Man. No, we had the rights. You know, the the rights were owned by Canon. You know, because Mnemonic had bought them. And we were buying them from Canon. In fact, it was on the boat in Cannes that year that I made the deal, and Schwarzenegger was there, and Schwarzenegger wanted to play Spider-Man. And I, you know, that wasn't going to happen, but nevertheless, he would have done something in the picture. And then we were negotiating, and there were a lot of rights issues and a lot of deals that Mnemonic had done that created problems. But when I left and we had the cash crisis, we lost it, but my buddy Kenny Lemberger over at Sony, he saw it, he grabbed it, and he said, I can work through all these things. And he did. He did. He took a lot of risk on it. You know, I really respect it. The risk that I would have taken too, figuring that would all be sorted out. Because Mnemonic had made a bunch of deals on the picture. And what those deals were those really a transfer of rights? You know, like MGM had video rights on it. But that was on a picture that was never made, all right? So in my opinion, that was what we call in the law an in personam contract. Meaning you just had a claim of damages against the person who licensed it, so you didn't have a lien on the rights, underlying rights. It was a very famous case involving De Laurentiis and Taipei, you know, on this. It just became Taipan, which became, you know, sort of the thing that we always used to talk about. If you have a picture that isn't made, you don't have a lien on the underlying rights, and you don't have a lien on a picture yet to be made. And I think you then just work it all out. You just bang it through, like getting out of the Showtime deals. And Kenny worked them all out and did an incredible thing for Sony. That was truly their most important franchise.
How did Carolco acquire the rights to Terminator 2?
That was a deal, all right. What happened was that originally the picture was made by Hemdale, all right? And the way Hemdale had done the deal was they had, on the underlying rights, were owned 50% by Jim Cameron, 50% by Hemdale. And Hemdale was run by this guy, John Daly, who was a character in our business, all right? One of the, again, foreign independent characters we dealt with. I never represented John, but of course I knew him. Mario always referred to him as John DeLay, not John Daly. And he was notorious about how hard it was to make a deal. And so this was going to be a job of work. All right. There were two jobs of work, one getting Hemdale's rights, and then the second problem was that when Jim and got divorced from, she was a great producer in her own right. I'm blanking. In any event, in the divorce, he gave her the rights, his 50% share of the sequel rights to Terminator for $1. So we had to make the deal with her. And at that time, Jim's position is she can't be on the set, she can't get a credit, I don't want to talk to her, all this stuff, right? So, God, I can see her in front of me, and I'm blanking on the name. So these were the challenges, right? Now, it started that because, you know, Mario had developed a relationship with Jim Cameron when he was on the outs. And, you know, after he had had the failure of The Abyss and some other things, and he was not what he is today, all right? But Mario had convinced him to come up with the idea for Rambo 2, all right? Now, the credits for Rambo 2 is screenplay by Sylvester Stallone and James Cameron, all right? But the great ideas came from James Cameron, particularly that opening where you see Stallone there, you know, against the metonymic fence, and he's a caged animal, right? And you see Richard Crenna come up, and then Stallone walks up to him, and Crenna says, "We got to send you back to Vietnam." And Sly says, "Do we get to win this time?" The place goes nuts, you know. And that was a perfect setup. And all this stuff that Jim did, you know, he's such a genius. And so the big issue with Terminator 2, as with all these sequels, is what's the good idea for the sequel? And in this case, it was unique because Arnold was the bad guy in the first one. Arnold's no longer a bad guy, right? Arnold's the good guy. So how does Arnold become the good guy? And what is the concept of the sequel? That was when Jim came up with that idea, discussed it with Schwarzenegger. They loved it. They brought it to Mario, said, "We want you to do it." But then Mario said, "I'll never get the rights. You'll never be able to do the deal with John DeLay." So what we did was, because I was on the, you know, looking for, so I made it. So I said to Franz Hoffman, "How much money?" Because he was the banker at Credit Lyonnais and a close friend of mine. "How much money does John owe you?" All right. He says he owes about $70 million. The bank's getting crazy. All right. I said, "All right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to offer you $50 million for his TV library rights. All right. and 10 million of that he owes me back, and I'm going to take a security and everything he has for it. And I said, you're going to have to force him to do it because he won't do it on his own. So, Franz said, sure. And so that's what we did. And then, of course, he didn't pay the $10 million back, and we levied on it and took the rights to Terminator. Yeah, and so we got it outright for $10 million. And John later sued the bank, claiming that, this was collusion or whatever, Franz and Peter, they knew each other, and he lost because the bank was owed this money. John owed the money, right? And that was his weak spot. So, yeah, I told Mario, this is the deal of the century for us. Get those rights outright for $10 million because they were worth, we knew there were more sequels, obviously. So, and then the picture was made.
And how did you confront James Cameron about going over budget?
Well, we started, when we went in, we kind of knew it was going to go over, right? And we had a meeting out at Mario's house in which I said, look, Jim, right now we agreed that we were going to have a 2-hour movie. We're not going to have a 3-hour movie. We're going to have a 2-hour movie. And right now they're telling me that what you got on the schedule is shooting maybe a 2.5 to 3-hour movie. We need to cut some scenes. We're not going to make the schedule. To which Jim says, but I don't know which 2 hours. And he wouldn't cut the schedule. And he went over. And then it's very hard to deal with him. And, he's a genius and he knows what he's doing. And he's focused entirely on that. He's not interested in money. He's not interested in anything other than him realizing the vision he has. And as an artist, who's to say he's wrong, right? But we were running out of money. I mean, we were going to be in trouble, and we were going to miss our July 4th release date, which would really hurt the amount of business we could do on the picture. And so at 2 weeks over, I told them, you got one more week. They kept going. They were going to keep going. I said, this is stopping at 30 days. Czar wouldn't say a word about it. He knew. And, Jim still hasn't spoken to me again as a result of this, right? And I said, we're stopping. We're taking the picture. We edit the picture and deliver the picture so it's released on that, or you do it, one or the other. All right, told his lawyer this. Lawyer said, Jim's taking his name off the picture. And I said, no, he isn't. He doesn't have an Alan Smithy clause, and he's, directing 90% of the picture. He's directed 120% of the picture. So his name is on the picture, right? So it's either he edits the picture or we edit the picture. The picture is coming out on July 3rd, period, full stop, all right? And, nobody likes that. You don't tell Jim Cameron that. Everybody in the business tells me you're out of your mind to do that with a talent like that. But we had to do it. I don't regret for a second doing it. I can still think he's the greatest genius that's ever been behind a camera, which I believe, and it was still the right thing for me to do to stop that picture at that point. And we stopped it. Jim later said to one of the people I know, he said, look, the worst they can do is kill us. Let's make the picture work. And he delivered the picture. He edited himself. I mean, he can do anything. And delivered the picture. And of course, he cut 20 minutes of cut footage out of the picture. That, was fully edited, everything was fine, but, and he got it down, so we made all the shows per day, and we've all put it in the director's cut later for video, but in any event, the picture was a sensation, and it was a sensation out of the box, and yet, at the end of the day, we went in at 89 million on that picture and ended at about 110, which was the most expensive picture ever made at that point in time. Now it's nothing. I look at it and say, well, that was a big problem for us because that was money we really didn't have, because that was more than you could pre-sell a picture. Even with incredible pre-sales, you can't get that level. And we ultimately got out of it. We did about 150 million on that picture in the first couple of years, so it was a great success. But at the end of the day, it would have been nice if we didn't have to spend that money. But I like to say that, okay, so the next picture he makes is True Lies, all right? That picture goes in at around the same, I was told by my buddies at Fox, around 85. That picture ended at 130, all right? And then there was the next picture called Titanic, all right? That picture went in at 110. That picture ended at 230, all right? So in the scheme of dealing with Jim going over budget, I'm happy with myself for achieving that result. and I can be the greatest admirer in the world of Jim Cameron, even if he'll never forgive me for shutting down his picture.
And you say he's still one of the greatest filmmakers ever was.
This guy is amazing. I mean, he can do everything. He could act if he wanted to. Another one of my favorite stories on the Terminator was we had one of the best second unit guys, Vic Armstrong, on the picture, did all the Rambos for us. And he quits after a week. So I called Vic. I said, what's going on? Is there a problem? There's no problem, he said. There's nothing for me to do. The man's putting out the smoke pots. There's nothing for me to do. He's going to do it all. He directs all the stunts. I'm not sitting around. You don't need to pay me to sit around. I said, that's great. We're happy to pay you to sit around. But he said, I understand if you don't want to. So he did. And I'll tell you another story this is a classic example of Jim Cameron. So he has the idea that, which is in the movie, to have a helicopter fly through one of the tunnels, one of the LA tunnels out there, right? And how are you going to do that? So we figure we can do a model shot. No. He wants to shoot the helicopter flying through the tunnel. Well, we told him, you can't do that. There's no insurance for flying a helicopter through that tunnel. And, so we shut down for the day, and Jim talks the helicopter pilot into flying the helicopter through the tunnel. And who is going to be on the camera rig in the tunnel being pulled back as that chopper inches through the tunnel? Cameron himself. Who else is going to do it? The operator wasn't going to get on that thing. He wasn't insured. Jim shot the thing himself. No problems. Everything was fine. And of course, it's an incredible shot. The zoom, he zoomed it up, the zooming through the helicopter, zooming through that tunnel, and there was another one, because he wanted to flip a double tanker trailer. Because flipping a bus, flipping a car, I mean, come on, you do that in television, right? He wanted to flip a double tanker trailer. But you can't flip a double tanker trailer because there's too much ballast. They don't fall over. They crumple, all right? So we said, we don't think it's a good idea. No, we're going to do it. And as I said, it's dangerous. No, everybody's ready. The stunt guys, whatever Jim wants, they're going to do, right? And so we, bar the whole thing in. The guy's locked in the cage, and we do the thing, and of course it just crumples. But it crumples with enormous weight. And, the damn guy was like about this much left, but nobody was hurt, thank God. And we ended up using the model shot, which is what we should have done after spending 3 days on that setup, right? But that's a genius. And, he is a remarkable, remarkable filmmaker on every level. And so I was very thrilled to have the chance to work with him on that picture, even if I had to be the bad guy at the end.
What's the second law in Hollywood?
Well, I always like to say the first law in Hollywood is that no good deed goes unpunished. And the second law in Hollywood that I like to say is that it's not enough that I succeed, my friends have to fail. There's a certain, sanguine quality to the competitiveness in our business, all right? And sometimes we don't give the recognition to our colleagues' success that perhaps we should. And therefore, some of the cattiness that you see comes out of that. And also, I have a third law, which is that anything that isn't done when it should will get screwed up. All right, you have a certain inertia with a film, and Barbet Schroeder used to say you have the centrifugal forces, and then you have the inertia, and you want to keep the things that keep it together as opposed to all the things that can make it fly apart. And so dragging things out and not getting things done, is to me is one of the ways you get into trouble on films. So those are things that are, kind of funny, ironic laws that we can say exist.
And these are laws we just have to accept? There's no changing them?
Yeah, I think you do have to accept them, but it doesn't mean that you don't try to manage them and keep them from happening. But it's as much for your own ironic self-distance so that you don't get too engaged in some of the stuff that happens and you just deal with it as a problem.
Is Hollywood a game?
No. The film business is a very serious business that it both makes entertainment, commerce, as John Dolgen used to call it, which is, it keeps, makes a big change in people's lives, but it also involves the making of really important works of art. And there are movies that change people's lives. There are movies that have enormous long-term effect on you, that can have an emotional power that really no other medium can have. I called my company Seven Arts for years because it is a combination of all the different art forms, and it gives the power that all of them, and that therefore is the most powerful medium for communication and artistic form. And when things are great movies, there's nothing like it. So it's really serious. And when you do it right and when you make something special, that makes it worth it.
What did Hollywood give you that you couldn't have gotten somewhere else?
Well, by Hollywood, I think you're talking about the film business. I think that the difference is that I always had a somewhat of an artistic bent, which I sort of, never really decided to work on. I was both writing poetry, acting, these things that I would want to do for myself, but I really didn't make a career of it, and don't know that I ever could have made a career of it. So what this does is the movie business allowed me to, as I got out of the purely finance and legal stuff and into the actual making of the movie, it allowed me to exercise those artistic impulses, if you could call it that. Allowed me to create stuff that I associate with myself, even though these are movies that have directors, they have writers, I don't take away from them, but that I got it made and had a lot to do with what the final product is. So that's why I love this when I take the presents credit on a movie, and that gives me a lot of fulfillment of the artistic impulses that I've always had that I didn't realize in my career directly.
How much ego do you have to work in the entertainment industry?
Well, I don't like the word ego as such. I think that tends to, put a slant on it. I think you have to have a tremendous amount of self-confidence. You have to really believe in yourself, because you have some very strong-willed people, and there are a lot of people in our business who get rolled over, who are there to basically be cup holders, and I think those people do not help the business, and they're not really the success. They're part of the problem of the business. So I think it's better when you have people that are very strong-willed, and that, and they have a great sense of self-confidence. They're not always right, like I'm not always right, but you got to have that. If you don't have it, you're not going to be able to go through what it takes to get a piece of work like a movie made and then distributed correctly. And so I have a great deal of respect for that, even on those people that I've disagreed with. As I say in the book I've had a lot of big fights with people that I have enormous admiration for, like we talked about with Jim on that financial stuff. All I can say is that's fine with me. I think it's great because we each had to have our strong point of view, and that's what led to something good. My wife likes to say, you can never tell a good director, writer, actor what to do. If they are, then they're a hack. All you can do is worry them. All you can do is get them to think maybe it's not as good as it should be yet. And in order to do that, you have to have a certain confidence. You have to have the ability to express yourself. You have to believe in what you're doing. And you have the ability to step back and recognize somebody else's point of view. So I think it's something that requires, for success, a very strong will and a very strong sense of self-confidence. I don't like to call that ego. I think ego is when you're just pounding on your chest and claiming credit for stuff you didn't do. That is ego to me. But most of the people I know that are great in this business have very strong sense of mind, and they're happy. They're very strong minds, and they don't need to run around taking credit for anything because everybody knows what they did. All right, and that's the kind of people I like.
Do you think there's a lot of beg for forgiveness, not ask for permission, but beg for forgiveness in this industry?
You hear that a lot. You're right. I tend to think it is more of a business thing than it is a artistic thing. I think that in the artistic process of making the movie, there's a necessarily collegial. The movies are made by a whole bunch of people, even if the director's the lead. And that requires a lot of give and take. And I think that's all up front and all done. And even when it's something where you're fighting with the studio or fighting with the financiers, you still have to do that. Rarely can you see that you can hide things or create it later. In business, sometimes you can, like for example, when Johnny Mnemonic was ready to go, and Mark Canton wanted to delay it to Memorial Day because now Keanu was a big star, and I already had my Golden Day release in Japan. I'm going in Japan. And he got pissed off at me and angry and yelled at me, and Kenny Limburger calls me up, and why did you do that? And yeah, that was one of the examples of what you can say, beg for forgiveness. But because I couldn't take away that release date from the Japanese. And it was really Mark's decision to change it. But he had the right in the contract, as Ken pointed out to me. He had the right to do that. I said, yeah, but he could have explained it to me. And I was too late, Ken. It was just too late. I couldn't do anything about it. I probably could have, but I told him it was too late. So we got through it. But he should have put the picture out earlier, because he wanted to go Memorial Day, and a picture was not a Memorial Day picture. It was too arty, too offbeat, too independent, really. Even with Keanu being a big star, it wasn't a Memorial Day movie. And I think Mark made a mistake by putting it there, and I think it hurt the ultimate results on the movie. Would have been better if he released it in the spring, actually. But it happened that way. But I don't think that's a huge issue in our business. I think most of it is all really knocked out in the course of making the movie.
I don't have the answer here, but can you guess how much money you've raised over the course of all the films you've made?
Oh, wow. Billions. I mean, it's well over $1 billion, but I don't know if it's $2 billion. But, between 1 and 2 billion, right? Let's say in that range.
Can you talk about the process of finding money for movies?
Well, yeah. I mean, a lot of the biggest monies we raised were in tax preference deals, but also they were in, in the stock market, and then in, lines of credit. So they're all different ways. I mean, stock market is one thing, selling securities. Another is bank lines, which are based on the amount of credit amount of collateral you have, and then the tax preference money is based on having the people that understand the tax risks and feel it's worth it to them. So I think it's between the three of them. Yeah, I could easily count $1 billion, probably closer to $2 billion.
You say that film financing is an art in itself, that those who master the craft will be in demand. What does it take to master the craft?
Well, it might be a little too much to call it a work of art, although I consider some of the deals I did to be works of art immodestly. The thing about finance is that you want to have people who appreciate the risk they're taking, all right? And, I like to say that if a person loses money in the shoe business, they made a bad deal, right? Lose money in the film business, it's those Sharpies in Hollywood took you, right? One of my favorite stories, we did, one of the most creative financing plans we did involved these insured financing. We came up with these risk insurance. It's like I could take a group of 5 Paramount Pictures and give them that they would get back out of a corridor 25% of the costs they had in the film, all right? So essentially, and I'd give them the money for that 25% with a bank line, guaranteed by an insurance policy with a AAA insurer. So this was a way of spreading risk among 5 pictures and delaying the payback and giving away no rights. So you could, at that time, Paramount, like many of the studios, wanted to get as much outside financing for the program as possible because the rates of return they were getting on the money were not the levels that the corporate people wanted, all right? So this was a way, if I get the pictures and I still get the same distribution fees, but I have less invested, then of course their rate of returns are better. And Dolgen was a big deal about that, as a number of the guys who were running the studios in those days. So he loved the insurance deals, and so we structured them with bank loans against the insurance policy, right? And the result of that was we did maybe $350 million worth of insured back fundings for Paramount on some 26 pictures over the 7 years of my Paramount deal. And then the deals blew up because a lot of bad deals had been done and the insurers stopped paying. And then then it sort of devolved. This was in my opinion, probably the most creative non-tax deal I had done. And it was blown up because of 2 things. One, Chase Bank, when the insurers refused to pay, all they needed to really do was just extend the claim determination date because the money was in the pipeline. We could see that the money was coming, right? And, the executive at Chase said, no, you don't understand. We have other of these risk insurance deals. We can't do that. We have to demand the insurers pay 100 cents on the dollar. And so the insurers didn't pay. They sued. They got 100 cents on the dollar over time. And then the insurers, of course, felt that they had been schnookered. So I know where I was leading with this. So so AXA, the big insurance company, which had been one of the main insurers in these deals, suddenly felt they were ripped off, all right? And they filed suit against me and against everybody, and they lost it all at the end of the day. But there's this, the second time I had one of these pen and ink drawings in the Wall Street Journal was this story, and it said that, AXA, that was what they called the mushroom effect. They were just little people under the mushroom, and this guy, Peter Hoffman, had talked them into these deals, and he really understood it, and they were all bad deals, right? And so that was an example of AXA, a gigantic company, is schnookered by me. I mean, please, all right? And so, of course, at the end of the day, not only did the bank get 100 cents on the dollar, but those pictures really paid off. So the insurers ended up doing what I had told them: just own the pictures, just put them in as another asset, just wait. The money is there. You got the Truman Show. You got, in fact, my favorite story is, after all of it, the one I said, there's this one picture you got to put in the deal. You got to put in the deal. It's a strange thing. You only have international rights. It's very expensive and all that, but you got to have this picture in the deal. How much does the picture cost? I said, well, it's going to be over $200 million. And he said, no, we're never going to do a picture. We can't do that. You know what that picture was? Titanic. They knew better, but I snookered them, right? But in any event, those deals ultimately turned out very well. And so the insurers flipped all those pictures they owned, actually, to Mark Cuban, and then Mark Cuban flipped them to somebody else. So at the end of the day, it all turned out that it was just fine. But at the time, it looked like I was this guy who had snookered all these big insurance companies into getting them into this deal, which, of course, to me was kind of funny. But it goes to why in the film business, people have to appreciate the risk, and they have to be able to manage that risk in their own minds. Like John Dolgen used to say, be aware of civilian investors. And what he meant by that is people that, would lose money in the business, and they would blame the business. They would think, oh, it's because of these terrible guys in Hollywood, when they just made a bad deal, right? Another story I like to tell is Jerome Seydoux, who was a very wealthy man, owns the Schlumberger fortune in France, and he bought a big controlling stake in UGC, and somebody said to him, Jerome, what are you doing investing all this money in the film business? Don't you know everybody loses money in the film business? To which Jerome Seydoux said, somebody's making money, the question is who? And I think that's really the thing you have to answer, and you ought to understand where the money is being made and what the risks are. So I try to deal with people who understand that. And they understand the risk of a bank, of whether or not you're going to get a particular receivable paid, the equity, whether or not there's going to be enough long-term value in it, and the tax preference, whether or not the tax benefits are going to be realized against what really is going to happen. And so a lot of it is the problem of explaining complex deals to people and expecting them to understand it. Whereas they often will be turned off by that when you really start to tell them, and they'd rather have their cousin talk them into a picture that, is so simple and it's going to be fantastic, and then they lose all their money. Oh, it's the film business, all right? And they didn't want to hear about what the real, risk valuations are in the business. Look, the problem with the film business is that each picture is its own new product. Like if you have a Ford car, selling a Ford car is a logo. There's a certain value to the logo. But it doesn't matter if it's Paramount or Warner. If the picture is a bad picture, doesn't matter what logo's on it, it's going to fail. And so each picture is its own new business. And therefore, what you are trying to find are those things that give it the better chance of success. And at the same time, a better chance of being a great movie. Because it isn't just about packaging the picture so it looks like a deal. It's actually that package will result in a picture that is a good movie. And so, those are, I quote in the book many times what Tom Pollock used to say to me. He said, Peter, if it was easy, everybody'd be doing it. And it isn't easy. And of course, I love that challenge. I love the challenge of all the different levels of complexity. But you can't separate the economics of the business from the finance, because the finance follows understanding the risk of the business and what level of risk you're taking on it, and hopefully with somebody that is actually ready to understand it.
Can you tell us about the moment you knew you were going to jail?
Yeah, we were with my grandsons out in Malibu in the summer, taking a house out there when my daughter and son-in-law and my grandsons were in town. And we got the decision of the Fifth Circuit affirming our conviction and reversing the order of probation that the judge had given me. The trial judge was a conundrum because he knew we were innocent, said he disagreed with the verdict, just didn't have whatever it took to really just end the case. We had heard rumors that he wanted to and just couldn't do it. And then we thought we had great grounds for appeal. And this decision by the judge on appeal was a catastrophe because he reversed the sentence of probation, which almost is never done, and said that the judge had to sentence us to jail, which was also not right as a matter of law. And even though there was all kinds of things, at that point, it was fairly clear that it was going to be an uphill battle to avoid going to prison, and particularly when, this judge, Judge Costa, just basically made it based on a whole bunch of false statements. He just made stuff up. It was truly an extraordinary situation to read that opinion, and that's when I knew. And it was a very tough time. I cried, and Susan held me, and it was a very hard thing. Not so much because at some point I was going to go to jail, but because it was so outrageous. It was so irrational. It was just something that, how could a judge, a federal judge, just make stuff up? Just make stuff up and make statements that were just preposterous on their face. And it just, I went into the law with great sense of idealism about what the law was. I had worked for judges, I had seen judges, and I just never thought a judge would be like this. And so that was a very hard moment. And that was when we knew it was only a question of time.
And why are you going public with your story now?
Well, like I think we talked about it. I went to Terminal Island, and my wife and my former partner Ray Gibson and this banker that I work closely with said, "You really got to write," and it was a way to pass the time. It was a way to keep myself occupied, and so I came up with this idea that this was my bardo, and I had to go through the bardo, and that I had to learn from it. I had to find something in it, and they all encouraged me to write the stories, and thought that people would learn something from it. And since I probably would never have taken the time to do it, but for being forced to do it, I decided to do it. And once having written it, then of course I wanted to publish it.
Your book, Karmic Wins, is about your journey in the entertainment industry, but also something that changed your life for better or worse. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, there was a program in Louisiana for infrastructure tax credits. It was very generous, 40%. And there were other benefits that went along with it. And so the idea was to, which we thought would be a great asset for our little public company, was to do a post-production and production center there and in the French Quarter with the residences. And there really weren't any post facilities in New Orleans or even in Louisiana, so that people would not just come there to shoot, but then would stay there to do the post. And Susan found this gorgeous property in the French Quarter, right on the edge of it, and we felt, oh, we can do this. And we set about doing it. And then, we made the request for the credits. We got some credits. And then it turned out the accountants had made some mistakes. And then when we tried to do a second one, they withdrew that, and I said, fine. But then even as they did that, the people who we had sold the credits to went to the Louisiana Department of Revenue, who said, that's fine, you got the credits, we don't care, they're withdrawn, you've got them. So the actual revenue people said they were properly granted. And they've never changed that point of view once, all right? Nevertheless, because there had been general investigations on the business by this U.S. Attorney's Office, and there's one particular U.S. attorney who, is kind of the C team there, they decided that they were going to use me as the test case for what was wrong with the Louisiana tax credit program, which they thought was just filled with fraud, and they were going to stop it. And there was one guy who worked in the federal government, in the state government, who was helping them, all right? And they decided that, our project was the one they were going to go after. And of course, they screwed up from the beginning. I mean, the level of incompetence in this is staggering. Because their whole theory of the case was, you got credits when you didn't actually pay the expenses. Right. Now, by this time, this is years later when we have paid all the expenses. So this is after we've done an audit that's shown everything, but they're going back to the other ones, the credits we had gotten before we had paid for everything. And they said, see, the statute requires you have to pay cash. The problem with that is the statute did not say that. The statute said that now in 2013. It did not say it in 2009. In fact, the legislature passed a special law in 2009 saying, yes, we're changing it so that it's only payment of cash, but that doesn't apply to infrastructure projects. A special decision by the legislature itself, and they ignored it. And they said, so, you were claiming credits when you didn't pay and the law required you to pay. Law did not require to pay. And they lied. And they got the state people to lie on the stand and say you had to have payment. The guy's saying, look, you just move money around. They move money around. You go to Walmart, you want a T-shirt, you have to pay cash for the T-shirt. Now, of course, that's nonsense. You can pay for it with a credit card. But what does that have to do with the tax credit, all right? So, and the second screw up was they said they lied. They didn't tell the accountants. They only showed the accountants the payment out. They didn't show when you sent the money back. And the small problem with that was it was all sitting in the office of the accountant, which they had to admit. So we fooled them how? And they had lied to the grand jury and said that we hadn't shown them the other side. Now, of course, if the accountants, they're accountants. If they wanted it, they would have asked for it, all right? But it was sitting in a box unopened. So the accountant at trial, the judge says, well, you had it in why didn't you open the box? And the accountant said, we didn't need it in our work. And that's how I defrauded them, by giving them a box they didn't open. Can't make this stuff up. You can't make this stuff up. This is how ridiculous this whole thing is. And it even is worse than that, as I try to go through in the book. And so I'm going through this total insanity because they wanted to stop the tax credit program, and that's what they did. $1.2 billion worth of film production the year of my indictment. Next year, it was down to $250 million, never recovered. They wanted to destroy the program because they didn't understand it and didn't think it was a good idea, these people in the federal government. And it was a disaster for the industry as well. The people lost their jobs, people that had moved there. There was a whole industry that was basically shut down. It all went to Georgia, which has $2.5 billion worth of film production, and Louisiana, doesn't. After my indictment, Avi Lerner had the studio in Shreveport, shut it down, handed the keys back to the city. Mark Damon and Moshe Diamond, who were making pictures in Baton Rouge, they told Chris Stelly, the guy who ran the division, you do this kind of stuff, why are we here? They went and made movies in Bulgaria. So it was just a self-destructive nonsense on the part of prosecutors who didn't know what they were doing and screwed up the case and then lied about it when they did. And their theory of the case, according to the judge, was, how did I defraud these people when I gave them the things and never looked at it? Their theory of the case was that I should have explained to auditors what I had given to them. That's how I had defrauded them. You can't tell auditors what to believe. The auditors have to look at it and make their own judgment. You can't tell the auditors what's there. They're supposed to decide what's there. So that would even be preposterous on its own face. And so and it just goes on and on. How could there be fraud when we completed the thing and put it in service and paid all the money by the end? We gave them everything they said. We promised a fully operational post-production studio. We had the Super Bowl in there. We had True Detective in there. We had all these shows in. What's the issue? We givered it. You don't like the way we did it, but we delivered what we promised to deliver. That was what the law. You can't have wire fraud if you deliver the benefit of the bargain. So how did the judge deal with that problem? He ignored it. He just didn't even address it. But my favorite of it is, we said, look, one of the problems here is you needed to give an instruction to the jury on the state law and what it meant. You need to tell them the state law did not require payment in cash. It was sufficient that there was an economic commitment. And the only reason why they circled the money was because the state required an audit trail to show the time and date and the recipient of the payment. Judge said at the outset, I'm not going to let anybody testify as to the meaning of the state law. I'm going to tell the jury what the state law is. Except at the end, he didn't, even though we asked him to. So one of the classic cases of reversal is you have an opinion, a instruction by the defense, and as long as that's a fair statement of the law, the court's supposed to do that. So that was a clear reversible error. So what did Judge Costa say about that? He said, and I can quote, Peter was convicted of lying, not violating state law. Now this, as I say in the book, I consider this complete vacuous sophistry. I was not convicted of lying. I wasn't even indicted for lying. I was indicted for wire fraud. Wire fraud means that I have to have taken property from somebody else. And how could I have defrauded the state out of credits to which I was legally entitled under state law to those credits as finally determined by the state itself? How could I do that? And I wasn't, of course, even indicted for lying. I was indicted for an implied misrepresentation because I delivered all these documents and didn't explain what they were. That was the theory of the case. So lying, I mean, it's just, it's one of those things where it's like the world we're in today with Trump and all this. You have stuff that's so insane, so irrational, stuff that you just can't even connect to anything. And that is a challenge in and of itself. And that was a lot of what, writing the memoir is about, going through it, just processing something that is so fundamentally nuts. And it happened. And so, at the end of the day, I go through it. There's still people that try to use it against me. Nobody who really knows me. Most of them know that this was a whole setup. They just wanted to get me and to shut down the program. That's most of the people understand it. But, there's still scumbags out there who try to use a, convicted felon without really knowing what happened. So, but again, I don't really care about that anymore. But as you can see, I still get quite exercised at the sheer irrationality of it, at the sheer silliness of it. Defrauding somebody, an accountant, by not explaining a document I give them. I mean, it's so ridiculous. You even say it, you wonder. Or that I defrauded the state out of credits to which they decided I was legally entitled to and entitled to more. How could I defraud the state out of credits to which I was illegally entitled to as a final decision of the state? And it goes on and on. I do other things on this. I don't want to keep ranting on it, but one of the things I wanted to do in this book and in the podcast is make very clear that I completely reject everything about this case. There are people I had at Terminal Island who did bad things, and they needed to be responsible for them. And if I did bad things, and I have done bad things in my life, I want to take responsibility for them. I'm not afraid of that, but not this, because this is just nonsense by federal prosecutors that didn't know what they were doing, that had an agenda. And they did something that was wrong, and they should ultimately be called to account for it. Maybe never they will, but I'm going to do my best.
And so at what point was Louisiana termed Hollywood South?
When the tax program came in, they were the most aggressive program around. That was in 2006, I think, 2007, in that time frame. By the time we were going full steam in 2009, that's when things were really going up. And like I say, it was up to $1.2 billion in 2014, which was the year of my indictment. And then by 2015, it was down to $250 million and has never recovered.
Because you can watch videos of people going into the town, coming from Hollywood, and they hint that the locals weren't necessarily happy with them there, if you go back and look at old videos. So how much of this were, maybe that some of the locals didn't want people from California coming into their area?
I didn't have any of that. I thought that everybody there loved the film business and were thrilled to get that kind of work. And, and people were always looking for different locations. And, of course, all the restaurants and the vendors and the hotels, they loved it, And so, I had nothing but positive stuff about the film business and what it was for the economy. Look, I mean, New Orleans and Louisiana is still a very touristy economy. Very much people coming from out of town, staying there, going to the restaurants, the hotels, and so I feel that that it was a perfect state to have a very aggressive tax credit program, and they screwed it up. They screwed it up big time.
Is there anything else you want people to know?
No, I mean, I think I've just said that I did not commit wire fraud. I got tax credits to which my company was legally entitled. The person I was ripped off because the state actually owes me another $3 million of tax credits on investment they certified that they never paid. So I was the one ripped off, not the state. And anything to the contrary is wrong. And so I want to make sure nobody has any doubt about my point of view on this. And it doesn't matter that there was a conviction. It doesn't matter that it was upheld. I know I'm right.
You've mentioned in the book you feel stronger despite what happened to you.
I do.
You would think this would break someone.
Well, that's the famous Nietzsche quote, that which doesn't destroy you makes you stronger. And I think you have to view it that way. If you can get through this, what can't you get through? Because in many ways, it's, look, going to Terminal Island for 8 months is hardly a huge problem. I mean, it's not like you're under torture or anything. You're fed, you sleep, you exercise. The problem wasn't going there. The problem was in the insane irrationality of the charges against me and charging me on things that was my reputation. Now, look, I wasn't really doing anything funny about the tax credits in Louisiana. This wasn't one of my plans. I was just doing what the guys down there said, this is what you do. So I didn't consider this any great concoction of mine at all. Say like the Brando deal or the Warner P&A deal or the Carolco tax plan or some of the things that I'm best known for. Those were things really, those were my authorship. This wasn't. This was just me following what I thought were the rules down there. But nevertheless, here it is, this guy with this great reputation on taxes, and he's, being charged with wire fraud and getting taxes. Now, a few people say this, well, wait a second. If this is tax fraud, why wasn't he charged with tax fraud? Well, maybe that's because the state didn't charge him with tax fraud. The state was the only state could have charged him with tax fraud because it was state taxes. But the state didn't challenge with tax fraud. So where's the tax fraud? So then you call tax fraud wire fraud. Except, wait a second, those are two different offenses. Tax fraud has certain requirements of the offense. Wire fraud is something else. You get to ignore all of the requirements of proving tax fraud through this wire fraud offense, which is so broad. So, it makes it look like I was guilty of tax fraud when they couldn't even prove one single element of tax fraud because they called it wire fraud and it was the federal government. Why didn't the state government? If this was so bad, why didn't the state come after me? After all, that was their money, not the federal government's money. They said it was fine. So, this is the kind of stuff that's so hard to process, so hard to deal with. And I have to pull myself back when I get into it like I am now. But nevertheless, the thing I come out of it is that if I can deal with this level of irrationality, then I can go through anything. This is as crazy as it could possibly get. In the core of what I had done in my career, for what I was known for. And for them to then come up with this nonsense and not even call it tax fraud. And yet everybody thinks I committed tax fraud. It is not easy, but I'm living with it. And the people that are around me that I care about me are all fine about it. They all know that it was complete bullpucky, and we have to rely on the fact that I know what the truth is.
Right, and it's deepened your faith?
It has.
Is that something faith was important to you in the past, or?
Well, I mean, coming to what I'll call it a deep appreciation of the Christian faith was something I'd worked on my whole life, all right? from a place of high skepticism through a place of really trying to understand Jesus' message in a really deep way, and in a very personal way. And going through this only reaffirmed everything about it that I thought was the right commitment of faith. And I say in the book, one of my favorite phrases is when Jesus is with the Samaritan woman and wants to draw some well, and she says, "Why are you here? Drawing a well?" And he says, "Well, you've been married 4 times. You're living with your 5th." And starts telling her about it, and she says, "Well, wow. Then how do we worship your God?" And he says, "God is spirit, and we worship it in spirit and truth." And that's really the heart of it. You gotta really have the spirit, and then that is the truth. And we worship it in truth, because the truth exists no matter what some government says or person says. The truth is the truth. And that is the Word. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and walked among us. Those are the things that matter to me, because it's truth. It's the language of truth, the language of what is right in the world, in dealing with people. When you go through something like this and you're seeing the opposite of it, then you just gravitate more to, yes, that's there. You have to have absolute faith that it's there. Because if you're relying on what's in the world, not going to be enough.
What makes a great film?
To me, there's Albert Grossman once said, there's some successes you can't be part of. And what he means by that is that each one of us has a way of doing a certain kind of success, and we can't do every single success. And the movie business is that way. That doesn't mean that every single movie that's a great movie is something that I could have made or that anybody else could have made. It's just what that was. And there's a personal element to it. And so you start, I think, with knowing what it is you can do, what appeals to you, what comes to your hand. And you have to do that to make a good movie, because if you try to make what somebody else is making or what somebody else thinks is a great movie, you're going to fail. That's somebody else's success. So the first order of business is to understand that you can't know everything and you're not going to do everything, but you can figure out some things that work. And to me, the things that worked are what I call a metonymic depth. A metonym is like a synodoche is a phrase that deals with a way of saying that one thing can be the other. One thing can be more than that thing, and yet it is just that thing. In Stander, a classic metonym was when Bronwyn has Thomas Jane tossing billiard balls in the air as he's talking about robbing banks. All right, that's a way of saying that's the juggling act. That becomes a metonym for what he's doing, and what movies are sort of when you say mise en scène, you're putting together into the scene the metonyms that you want that will project a meaning that is beyond what the frame is. It has to say something more than what the frame is, and getting that in a series of frames that then gives you a metonymic depth to what the movie's about. And you do that through transitions, like what Spielberg talks about. You do it through what you place in the scene. You do it by counterpoint of one character against the next. All the various ways in which you can show meaning, and therefore it gets a sense of depth. I talk a lot about Mnemonic, which to me is the one that I can most easily talk about as a great film, although there's many films that I've been involved in that I also would do that. But trying to find those moments where you can have something that's a very simple frame of images, and yet it has so much depth of meaning to it that then lasts, and you can for an audience it can be almost emotional. It's not like you've rationally understood it. It's not like I see what they're doing here. It's just it just is. And you know, when it's great like that, you know, particularly for those of us who spend our life in it, then, you know, wow, it's something else. So yes, metonymic depth is the phrase I use. That's what I try to get, something in a movie that shows something that's a simple story, that means something, affects people emotionally, but when you think about it, the frame shows a lot more.
As a storyteller, how important are heart and brain to making a movie?
Well, they're the same. I mean, you know, the heart doesn't have consciousness, and the brain has feeling. So I think that there is, movies are about feelings. They're about a projection of emotion. As we like to say, dialogue is for dialogue, for character, but music and sound is for emotion. And we are projecting emotion all the time in every scene. And you know what that emotion is and how you transition from the emotion. Spielberg always likes to say you cut on emotion. You cut on the transition of an emotional element. And so movies work when they apply and affect the emotions that you're expected to feel, and that you have this narcissistic identification with the protagonist or the antagonist, and you connect emotionally to what they're going through. When you feel those emotions, then you're in the movie. You're not sitting about thinking I'm in a movie theater. You're in the movie. You know, you've had the suspension of disbelief, to use the old phrase. You're now there. And that's the magic of movies, when you can get that to happen. And that requires emotion. You only do that when you're emotionally involved with the scene. But naturally, it takes a lot of intelligence to get to that place. And so, you know, in that sense, heart and mind always go together.
You thought maybe you would go into politics or law, or you weren't sure maybe at first when you were at, you know, Yale. You had a difficult childhood, things that would break a lot of people, but you admired your own strength, and you wanted to be strong. There were times in the book where you said you felt maybe you weren't strong, but do you think that's why you were drawn to film? The emotion that you just talked about, that we feel it, we don't even realize what we're sort of experiencing, but we're seeing
I look
something?
at it as entirely different. I look at it as if this was a karmic thing, that I was going to be dragged into this, and I didn't have any idea I was going to do it. It wasn't like I chose it. It was all more of a series of accidents that happened. Things that, and then, you know, and not only that I got involved in particular things, but then really unique problems were dropped in my lap. I mean, because look, I could be as, you know, the smartest guy in the world, but if I just deal with personal injury cases, what am I going to do? And, you know, to be into the film business, instead of just doing a bunch of contracts, I get these the incredible problems that Alex Salkind had, or all the issues that we had at Canon and Carolco. I mean, wow, you know, that's the kind of stuff that is just fate. Fate meant that was where I was going. I was drawn into it by a series of events that I can't describe, and that I treat as just part of the karmic fate of what was meant to happen to me. Just like what this craziness in Louisiana was meant to happen. It had to happen, and for whatever reasons, for this life or another life, and I have to, you know, address that. But this thing with the film business and how I got into it and how it became my whole life is a big surprise. You know, I started out thinking that films were sort of nothing. I mean, you know, as I say in the book, music was to me that's what I grew up on in the 60s and 70s, was music. So it started with Albert and with the, you know, Dolly and all that. I mean, you know, that was great. Then film, I didn't really understand it. And starting with Canon, it was easy not to, because they were making a lot of stuff that wasn't very good. But then I started to understand it. And then it started to really, really take over my life.
Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. Here is a complimentary question from our book Story Questions.